You are listening to Hysteria. Alyssa's with me. We're about to bring the panel in. Alyssa, I know that your book, you have a chapter on sex. I think you could probably recite what the chapter is.
The chapter I wrote about sex says, I have nothing to say about it.
Yes. Alyssa Mastromonaco, famously squeamish about speaking about her own sex life.
Thank you so much for flagging that up front.
We're going to talk about the general environment in which we form our sexual identities and the culture around that. And I think that a couple of our guests might be able to talk about that more specifically. First up, our next panelist is going to have a movie made about her.
What?
You've heard her on this podcast before. You might have seen her unanimously pass a sexual assault survivors resolution at the United Nations. Heard of it last month. She advocated it with her nonprofit Rise. We are so excited to announce that she is now joining the Hysteria crew as a member of our regular rotation. Amanda Nguyen, welcome to Hysteria.
Thank you. I'm so excited.
Okay, wait, a movie? How, though?
Details.
Yeah. When the press release came out, I was actually surprised because I didn't know that Forrest Whitaker was an executive producer. Kelly Marie Tran is playing me. And so, my friend made the joke, of course, Rose Tico and Saw Gerrera would make a movie about an in real life rebel. But it's such an incredible honor, and I'm so excited. I'm so grateful.
Yeah, that's really, really cool. I will be watching, probably streaming it for sure. And our next panelist is new to the pod. She's a writer and advice columnist who just recently published her book, Bad Sex, a memoir social history blend that examines the enduring barriers to true sexual freedom. I have a copy of it now. It's a beautiful book and it's wonderful. Love it, love it, love it. Nona, Willis, Aronowitz, welcome to Hysteria.
I'm so excited to be here.
So, Nona, I'm going to start with you. Since this is your book, you called it Bad Sex. What is your experience with, what do you mean when you say bad sex? What's your experience with it?
I think the title means several different things. I mean, one, it does mean actual sex, like the kind of sex that in your gut is just not doing it for you, but you're having it for reasons other than pleasure. And I think a lot of us have sex for all kinds of reasons besides pleasure. But bad sex, I mean, it could be the mechanics are bad, but more often I think it's because our expectations or our desires are not lined up. That there's some outside pressure that's making us have this sex, even though we don't really want to have it. Or it could be like a direct pressure of somebody pushing our boundaries or something like that. But I think even more broadly, what I mean by the title is we're at this point where the sexual revolution was decades ago. Sex has gone mainstream. Feminism has certainly gone mainstream. And we have all this information about how to give ourselves mind-blowing orgasms and how we deserve pleasure. And there's vibrators galore. And there's all kinds of spaces to be honest, supposedly to be honest about your sexuality. And yet there's still stubbornly few ways in which women in particular can feel sort of sexually free and open. And there's just a lot of ways in which sex and relationships can go bad. So the title is kind of multi-layered, I think.
So first of all, Vibrators Galore sounds like a really funny name for a sex toy emporium. If you ever open one, Nona, you should call it Vibrators Galore. Amanda, I wanted to pivot to you since I'd imagine that you have opinions on sex education and consent and pleasure in general. So how did your sex education teach you consent?
Yeah. To answer your question, I don't think that there's enough sexual education. Of course, it's still taboo, and when we think about it from a American standpoint, in places in America, as I was doing my advocacy to, protect rape survivors, it was such a huge just jarring context to be in, because I've done this work, in refugee camps as well. And in refugee camps, some of them, reproductive health care after an assault is just, it's not guaranteed, but it's supposed to be guaranteed. People just assume like that's a thing, that's a right that you have. And I was doing this work in Alabama, and that's absolutely a non-starter, right? And so I think that there are so many different standards, even within our country, where education and consent and the definitions of what is taboo and what is not really varies. But I think that women's pain is fetishized and that our joy is demonized. And because of that, we see politics become really integral when we talk about sex. So much of it is about controlling a woman's choice in so many aspects. It's not only reproductive healthcare. And, I remember I grew up in California. So sex education was literally, in high school, your parents had to sign something and you had one day, right? And that was it. Consent needs to be taught much earlier than that. And I think, need to have just a much broader conversation about this at a very early age.
Tell me about it.
Yeah, I mean, seriously. And Nona, in your book, you talk a little bit, I don't have the quote right in front of me right now, but you made a point in something that you wrote about how there's nothing more joyless than the obligatory pursuit of sexual exploration. Can you talk a little bit about that? Why do people joylessly pursue sexual exploration?
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of hard to untangle, but basically at some point, I peg it to the 90s, there became this sort of flattened version of sex positivity where it was kind of pathetic and lame to not explore as much sex as humanly possible, or at least explore as much pleasure. It's the Samantha from Sex and the City vibe. It's the you go girl kind of vibe, but the sex element of that. And I think, I was growing up right in this thick of this era where I got the message, if I wasn't constantly in sexual pursuit and feeling myself and trying to get these explosive orgasms, then what was I even doing? My life was lame. My life was awful. Later, of course, I inject a little nuance in that perspective, but I think that's where I think a lot of people our age, Gen Z actually, I think is rebelling against this, but a lot of millennials did get this message of sort of you have to be this perfect sexual human. And I am kind of describing a rarefied group, right? There are a lot of people in the United States who are still much more influenced by conservative notions of sex, that sex is shameful, that sex is evil, that you shouldn't have it unless you're in a relationship or a marriage. But I think a surprising amount of people feel the opposite, that they feel a little ashamed, that they're not in a relationship, that they're not that interested in sex. And I think a lot of asexual people or people who aren't asexual, they're just not that interested in dating right now. They sort of feel a pressure to do it anyway, especially in certain environments like college. I'm the sex and love advice columnist for Teen Vogue, and this probably is the most frequent question that I get. It always goes something like, all of my friends are hooking up, but I actually don't feel like doing it. Am I a freak? Am I weird? Is there something wrong with me? And I think finally Gen Z does feel empowered to just say no to sex that they don't want to have. But I think it's a real millennial thing to feel hesitant to not have this joyless pursuit of sex all the time.
Mm-hmm. Alyssa, you're nodding. Did you feel similar pressure?
Hitting home. My senior year in college is when Sex and the City debuted. Okay, so 1998. And growing up, I felt like very fine and normal in high school. And our extent of sex education, was on a microfiche. Google it if you've never had one. But it was on a microfiche, and my best friend, I hope she's listening because she'll be proud that I'm shouting her out, got into a fight with the health teacher, who was also our gym teacher, because the answer to the question about how you contract AIDS included from toilet. I mean, like, it was the wrongest answer ever. And she's like, this is wrong. This is not how you get AIDS. And it was just very, very outdated. I think some of our textbooks were from the late 70s. And early 80s. And so I was just kind of like me. And then you start hearing, and I took feminist theory in college and all this, and I was like, oh my God, what's wrong with me? I'm not like this. I must not be a feminist. I'm like a bit of a prude. I mean, not a prude, but like a prude. And which is, guess what? As a liberated woman now, I can be like, and that's fucking fine. But back then, that was not at all how it was. If you were not Samantha Jones by 1999, you were repressed. That was the feeling, is that, oh, Alyssa might be repressed. Do you know what repressed means, Alyssa? And I was like, no, stop giving me 17 magazine. I'm fine. But so this was very much which is why when I wrote my book and the publisher had said, you should write something about sex. And I was like, well, do you want me to be true to me? Because I'm not writing about it. It's not something that I do. And I think that was sort of, everybody, you'd get around and everyone would literally make up stories. This was, again, the late 90s. About how adventurous you had been, or like what you had done and who did what. And it was like, if you couldn't keep up, there was something wrong with you. And that was a very hard time for me.
Amanda, I wonder how you feel about this particular topic. Do you think that there's a pressure in the U.S.? Because I think that making the distinction that there's totally different attitudes around sex and consent around the world. But like in the U.S. and among, let's say, college-educated women, do you think that there is a pressure to be like more aggressively sexual than a lot of people are comfortable with?
Yeah, I think that pressure has always existed, but in different forms and in different ways and under the gaze of the patriarchy. In some ways, it has been, oh, well, if you are really sexual, you're liberated, right? You're not repressed. But I also think it really just boils down to choice, right? And your ability to just do what you want. And if that means not having sex, that's okay. But something I really do want to talk about is sex and politics in the bed. Because I think that there are some fascinating studies on how people's partisan identities are stronger than race and ethnicity, and that like most people, when you hear, if your partner is of a different party, like that's even, that's so wild, right? Like people don't know how those marriages work. And those perceptions, I think, are more and more in this partisan times just more divided.
Mm-hmm. Talk more about that.
Okay, so I do have studies, so I'm going to read them right now.
Okay.
Okay, so about 7 in 10 Democratic daters would not consider being in a relationship with a Trump voter. And there was this study, a Stanford scholar, that found that the strength of people's attachment to their political parties surpassed affiliations with their own race, religion, and other social categories. And we have to talk about this new dating app. I don't know if you've seen it, but it's called The Right Stuff. Have you heard about it? It's a dating app only. It's a dating app only for conservatives. And let me tell you, I'm not kidding you. One of the prompts that's on the dating app says January 6th was blank. No. January 6th was blank. Yeah. And if you have been on TikTok lately, which, yeah, I have, people, there are literally like FBI officers. They're like jokes, but I don't know if they're jokes of like FBI officers like on this app because they want to see what people say in this prompt.
Shit.
Oh my
Seems
gosh.
smart, actually.
Yeah.
Nona, I wonder, like, so as an advice columnist, you get questions. Do you get a lot of questions from people who are kind of agonized, I want to say, or torn over being attracted to somebody who has a different political ideology from them? Is that something that like young women and advice seekers are worried about?
I mean, most people who are writing me are in their teens, and nobody is more self-involved than teens. Like, I love them, but they are. Nobody's talking to me about politics. They're asking basic questions about matters of the heart, like, how do I tell somebody that I like them? How exactly does P and the V sex work? Stuff like that. Like, they're not talking about ideology, which is interesting. And sometimes they're talking about identity, of course, but they're not really talking about like tribal commitments. Like, I must not like this person or that person yet. I'm sure they will. And I feel like college is like probably when you do that, if you do go to college. But honestly, to me, the 7 and 10 thing seems low. Like, I can't imagine being a Democratic woman who cares about basic rights for women, reproductive rights or otherwise, and voting for a Republican, because at this point, there's an open agenda to roll back that those rights. Like, it seems kind of like at this point, now that Roe v. Wade has fallen, there's really no plausible deniability about what Republicans want to do when it comes to women's sexual freedom and reproductive freedom. So I don't really identify as a Democrat per se, but I'm on the left, and I certainly wouldn't even think of even dating one of those guys who are like, let's make a compromise and ban 15-week abortions.
Yeah, I mean, that's a ban. It's still a ban. You know, like they make it out to be a compromise. I think that's a super interesting segue into talking a little bit about our current political moment as sort of a response to the sexual revolution, which again, you know, happened decades ago. Why do you think that the tale of like the backlash to the sexual revolution is so long? Like, how have they been so focused on this for this long? Nona, I feel like this is something that you've sort of thought about.
I mean, I'm just going to paraphrase Michelle Goldberg from the New York Times, who I don't always agree with, but she said something very astute, which is the last several decades of figuring out these dilemmas are a result of liberating sex without liberating women. Like, it's kind of just as simple as that. You can't just have a sexually liberated society where misogyny is rampant. It's never going to be a safe place for women or other people of marginalized identities, like women of color or people of color or LGBTQ people, to safely explore sex. Like, it's not going to be neutral until those things are eradicated, which they probably won't ever be. And sex sometimes gets framed as, it's fun, it's no big deal. Don't take it so seriously. At least that's kind of how it was framed during the sexual revolution. Like in the 70s, everybody's just having sex with everybody and like, don't have hang-ups, baby. It's all fun. And I think that ever since then, people have been responding by saying, look, we are more vulnerable members of society, and it's much more complicated for us to be sexually liberated. And I think the sexual revolution was, not exclusively, but primarily conceived by men or through the lens of male desire. I think that there were a lot of ways in which women tried to inject their own desires. Starting from the 50s of women who loved Elvis or the early radical feminists who were exploring pleasure in the consciousness raising sessions, or even women who were supposedly objectified by, porno chic or sexual revolutions culture, but we're feeling a bunch of relief for not being called a town tramp anymore. There were women who were harnessing their desires during this time and continue to. But I think the sexual revolution was never a revolution for everybody. It was primarily driven by what men wanted and what men wanted to be available. And so that's sort of how the problem started. And it's never been truly resolved because misogyny is stubbornly rampant.
Amanda, you were nodding feverishly during portions of Nona's response. I would love to hear your thoughts on who benefited from the sexual revolution.
Yeah, and I think that the lens of, again, these movements being traced back to still the male gaze, I find within my field, which is sexual violence advocacy, so often rape survivors are actually known for who assaulted them, right? So when people identify survivors, oh, it's Bill Cosby survivors, that's Epstein survivor, and so their identity, what happened to them, their body is still tied back to a man or their perpetrator. And, it's really upsetting, but it I think is one of the examples of how tight of a grip the patriarchy in our society views this issue while it's still stemming from a male perspective. Even in the Me Too movement, right? So Tarana Burke has continually said that the movement is not about ripping down perpetrators, ripping down men. And yet when we look at the news and the way that the news portrays this issue, the part that they focus on is the sex, the scandal, and the man. So often we don't know the names.
Got Me Too'd. Like, he got Me Too'd.
Right? It's not about the survivors or the women. So, I think that's deeply unfair. And it's also a symptom of, again, this being traced back to a male gaze. And so how do we burn it to the ground?
I don't think we have enough matches, but I guess maybe we need to get a gas can. Alyssa, you kind of were talking earlier about sex education, and we've kind of all danced around this, but haven't really drilled down on consent in sex education. Like, was consent taught to you as part of your sex education? How did you learn what it was and how to and how important it was?
So I learned about consent, truly, if I'm being totally honest, my junior year at the University of Wisconsin, because I had transferred and I started, I unwittingly was living on Fraternity Row, Langdon Street, shout out. Mm-hmm. And the oh my God, what was the name of the Take Back the Night? Remember Take Back the Night? Mm-hmm. Okay.
I was just going to say Take Back the Night. Yeah.
It was Take Back the Night. And so Take Back the Night had been at the University of, how weird, the University of Vermont. For some reason, though, the messaging, because Vermont's not a very Greek school and it's hippy dippy, like you can smoke weed but not drink booze. It's just a different vibe. And when I got to Madison, it was very clear. We had flyers. There were sessions. There were groups in the student union where you could go and hear the leaders of Take Back the Night, and they would talk to you about what can happen. Right now, of course, it's different now. I mean, back then it was like, here's what can happen if you stay at the frat too late. It was still what situation did you put yourself in and how to get yourself out of it, as opposed to how it's not your fault. But and that's not their fault. I mean, it was 1995. But that was the first time it's like, no means no. You can say no at any time. It wasn't about saying yes to things, it was not the saying yes, like, yes, this is what I want to do. Let's have a conversation. It was more like, stop, you've gone too far. This is not what I want. It felt more dramatic, I guess, kind of, but they really did. I will say that there was a lot of messaging and a lot of conversation around it back then, finally. But it was not part of my microfiche in 88.
Right. Yeah, I think we had transparencies. We were beyond.
Yeah, that's what it was. It was transparencies, not a microfiche.
Yeah,
it was transparent.
We had transparency
overhead projector.
Machines. Yeah. Amanda, you were in college during, I guess, the years that the campus rape discussion was huge. And, I was I'm like in between Amanda's age and Alyssa's age. And I remember thinking when campus rape became a big topic again, like, I remember this being a topic already. All of these like sessions, and it was something that was talked about on the news, and there were 2020 segments about it. And, now we're back here again. How did that play out when you were in college? How did the consent conversation go?
Yeah, well, I think that we're seeing that cycle you mentioned because colleges have built-in transfers, right? You graduate and then, the protesters are gone and, they just wait their time in order for the dissent to cycle out, which is why it's really hard to sustain that kind of activism within a system that gives you, 4 years. I actually decided to tackle the United States government with my advocacy instead of Harvard, because I thought that the United States government would be easier. And the reason why is because I had seen all of these campus sexual assault advocates and how terribly, universities treated them. And that, at least in private institutions, even if they get federal funding, the bottom line wasn't the same, right? It was like, oh, we're not here to prosecute. We're not here, questionable whether or not like a student's safety is even part of the mission. But in the United States government, I was like, okay, these are rights. You have a baseline and I can hold you accountable to the thing that you tried to get elected for. But I often think about the bravery of all of these activists who stood up. When I was there, they had, these Title IX protests and they put on their graduation caps Title IX. And it was a huge deal. Unfortunately, one of my class day speaker, he had 20 women come out against him and he's still allowed to speak. And I remember people getting up and leaving. But yeah, I mean, they have these, again, waves built in so that people graduate out. And that's why we're seeing it over and over again. But I think the flip side to that is that we will always be speaking up about this. And, it's just because we graduate out doesn't mean that the fight is over.
That's so funny that you say that, Amanda. I feel the same way about feminists, that every few years, feminists kind of graduate out and then we start having the same conversations over and over and over. I was actually not in college, but a journalist, sort of in the midst of the timeline of my book when the campus assault conversation was happening. And I felt like I really could have used it when I was in college, because I think I was still having the take back the night no means no conversation. And then all of a sudden, yes means yes became the standard. And I think it honestly got very skewed. People were very facetious about it, being like, oh, do you now have to have a contract to have sex? But when you really start looking into what it means, I was very attracted to this idea of sort of this humanizing ethic of sex, of just is the person who you're having sex with wanting to have sex with you? And are they having a good time? And are they tuned into your pleasure and vice versa? And it was sort of this basic thing that I didn't have in college.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, Nona, you and I are the same age. And it was a similar vibe. A complicating factor for me was I went to a Catholic school. And so sex was something that it was against the rules. You could get kicked out of school for getting caught having sex, for real.
In college?
Oh, yeah. There were also really strict visiting hours for men's and women's dorms. After midnight on weeknights and after 2 a.m. on weekends, you couldn't be in another dorm. You couldn't be in the opposite sex's dorm room. I guess gay people didn't exist on Notre Dame's campus. They totally did. And when I was in school, there was kind of a debate, maybe my junior year, about how after visiting hours were over, there were security guards in female dorms, but not male dorms. So there was a way that people broke the rules. There was okay, you got to sneak in this side door and go up the fire stairs of this dorm. And you go 10 minutes before the end of the night and you pee in the guy's sink. Yeah. You would pee in their sink because if you went down to the bathroom, you could get caught. The way the rules were set up, though, up until I want to believe my senior year, was that basically that set of rules, they were called parietals, made it so if you were breaking the rules and you were in a boys' dorm, it made it so that it was easier to break the rules in a boys' dorm, right? It also made it so if you got caught in a boys' dorm, you could get in huge trouble. So if you went into a guy's room before, the lockdown happened and there was something non-consensual that happened, if you reported it, you could get in trouble for breaking the rules.
Wow.
Yeah. And it was until that wasn't how the rules were supposed to be. And there wasn't anything explicitly that said, if you are a victim of assault, you will not get in trouble for breaking parietals. But it was like it was crazy. It was crazy backwards. And it's still not exactly the most forward thinking space today. But like going to a religious college was a real mind fuck. It certainly didn't help me reach a point where I understood consent, pleasure, and doing things because I wanted to rather than doing them because I thought that that's just how you're supposed to act when you're in your 20s. Like I was kind of poisoned by the Cosmo fun, fearless female thing. I was like, well, I guess you're like, guess we're putting donuts on penises. Like, guess we're doing that. I don't know. I didn't really have like enough experience to understand that some of that was just like entertaining and some of it was actually sort of meant to be fun, but as the only model of like how to be a sexual cishet straight woman in the world, it's sort of like kind of messed my brain up a little bit. But I wanted to talk to you, Nona, real quickly. So, right now we're living in an environment. We talked about politics. The politics of the day is that there's one political party that has rigged the system so that they are going to be in power despite the fact that a minority of Americans agree with them in many places. And we have a Supreme Court that is ready to overturn and roll back years and years of precedent and rights that people have over their bodies. Roe is over. Right now, in some places, if you're a young woman and you have sex with a man, being around a man, he could rape you. You could get pregnant. You could then be forced to be a mother. There's no repercussions. Do you think that the young generation is starting to view hetero-sex as not worth it?
I wouldn't go that far. I think people think of Gen Z as like, most of them are queer and like trans and like going off, like they're not having sex at all. But actually a huge amount of them are still, like I said, grappling with the same questions that we are and still trying to make heterosexuality work. I think even like trying to make it work. I honestly don't think that has ever worked. A lot of people in mass defecting from heterosexuality. It's defeatist and it's unrealistic and it's denying people's true desires. I think a lot of people are truly heterosexual. And a lot of women genuinely do want to figure out how to safely and joyfully have sex with men, partner with them, have families with them. And I think for a lot of people, and this was true in the beginning of second wave feminism, I think a lot of feminists were banking on the fact that a lot of people are still going to be heterosexual, and that'll be kind of a motivator for them to continue trying to make things better. I think like when we think of people saying that, oh, men are trash, they're not worth it, like I'm just going to be a lesbian, haha, like that sentiment, which is often called heteropessimism. Asa Saracen coined that term, and I think it's a great term. I find it to be extremely dismal. I find it to be giving up too soon and relinquishing your own desires because you're embarrassed about them and you're too depressed about the state of things.
Is it embarrassment though? Like if giving into your desires could subject you to this whole host of,
No, I'm saying people think that being heterosexual is an embarrassment.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, like they're embarrassed to be heterosexual. And I mean, I understand, like I've engaged in hetero pessimism also. I've been like, damn, like why am I putting so much effort into a group that often like has no respect for my gender? But I think to think of your own desires as an embarrassment is sort of a non-starter. It will not get you anywhere.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a sort of through line, is that throughout history, people have been thinking of their desires as an embarrassment, and this isn't anything new. You know, it's a new type of shame. It's a new flavor of shame, if you will.